Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Yes, you guessed it. It's a Leman Russ main battle tank. In the style of Hello Kitty. Do not adjust your sets. This is all intentional. There is a reason I'm doing this. I'll explain it at the end. It's a very good reason. But I am doing a Leman Russ main battle tank from the Warhammer 40Ks in pink with Hello Kitty markings all over it, because of course I am. Anyway, let's crack on. So here I am in the spray booth, and you can see here I've already primed the model. It's not actually red plastic, it's been primed with Citadel's Rattlecan Mephiston Red primer spray. Now it is important, not so much when you're brush painting, but when you're airbrushing, it is very important to consider the colour of your primer. The reason is when you're airbrushing, the paint you put on tends to be a lot thinner than when you brush it on, so it's going to be more transparent, and you're going to see through your paint coat whatever colour is underneath, or at least it's going to affect and tint the paint coat you've applied. It's going to shift the colour. So for example, if you spray yellow over blue and you're only doing a thin coat, your yellow can be shifted towards the green end of the spectrum because the blue is interacting with it. You can basically see the blue through the yellow. Same with this pink. At first I was just going to spray it black because I was going to do a brush paint job. Then I thought, no, I'm going to airbrush it, but then I decided not to use the black primer. Black primer would have been slightly visible through the pink, and it would have shifted it and made it more bluey, bluer end of the spectrum, and changed the tone of it. I want a bright pink, or a sort of bright pink. So I had a choice. I did order some white primer to get the boldest pink possible, and I got that. It took a few days to get here, and I got that. But then I decided, as soon as I was about to spray it, I realised I had a can of the Citadel Mephiston Red, and I thought, well, it's a sunny day, it'll take me 5 minutes, out to the garden I go, blap, red. And it's a good choice because red it makes the pink not quite as bright and vibrant as white, but it does bolden the pink a little bit and make the pink give a bit more depth to it. Now, that's not to say that you want to completely cover the primer. You can, if you've got a darker primer, you want to use it to your advantage. You want to use it to do some pre-shading, to get some areas darker where the primer shows through more, and some areas lighter where the paint is less transparent. I'm spraying Vallejo Game Air Squid Pink. And what I'm doing a thin misty key coat first. I've got it about 15 psi, and I've added a little bit of thinner. It is a Game Air paint, so it's pre-thin for airbrush, but I've added a little bit thinner. I'm doing a thin, very light, delicate, misty key coat on each panel first, flashing it off with a little bit of air for like 5 seconds, and then I'm just carefully brushing over the paint, but I don't want to completely cover it. I'm doing a light misty coat and building it up slowly so that in some areas there's less paint and it's a little bit darker. That way I just get a nice variation. Now, I will admit, it didn't quite come out like I'd hoped. It did come out a bit overall basically pink and with not much shading. I went too heavy with the pink paint, and the red primer wasn't quite dark enough as I'd expected or planned. So it didn't quite come out pre-shading, but it sort of worked. To try and get a bit more contrast back into it, because like I said, it was a bit of a homogeneous pink coat. I wanted a bit more contrast. I went in with a second coat of the squid pink, but this time just focusing on the centre of panels. I dropped the pressure down to about 10 psi, took the crown cap off, and it just allowed me to get real close to the model, and so I could get some paint on there without pulling back too far on the trigger. I could just focus them on the centre of panels, just to build up a bit more paint, make it more opaque so it looks more brighter pink, and by default then the areas where the paint is thinner may look a bit darker in comparison. It's all about contrast. When you're building something smaller than the real thing and you're trying to paint it convincingly or make it interesting, just putting on a coat of paint and that's it done, that's the most boring thing ever. You go to a model show and there's a load of like just flat painted Spitfires with no weathering. It's like, wow, I could do that when I was 10. You want to build up contrast between light and dark, and you want to exaggerate it because it's miniaturized. It may not look super realistic, but it just makes the model pop. And this is what I'm trying to do. I didn't get it on the first pass, so I'm trying it now on the panel centers, just to make it a bit, more contrasty between the light and dark. doesn't quite work, but I didn't know that at this point. I still wasn't getting quite the contrast that I wanted, so I added some Viejo Game Colour Dead White to the Squid Pink. Also, I recommend adding some little stirring glass or stainless steel balls to the Dead White. It's really, really thick. You have to shake the crap out of it. And you can see here on this little test panel underneath, I'm getting that kind of light and dark contrast, which is more what I was looking for. So same process as before, drop the pressure down to about 10 psi. I've thinned it quite a bit because the Game Colour paint is really thick. And I'm just carefully adding it. Now, I am actually going a little over the panel completely, just you can see here I'm waving the airbrush around. It's just because I like to do a big wide blap but very, very fine mist of the colour first over the whole panel just to prepare it, and then do the focus bit in the middle. It just means I don't go from the new colour to the old colour. I've got a little bit of a fade there. So once I've gone round, I'll probably be more focused on the centre of panels. It looks weird, but trust me, it works. For the next step, once all that had been done and dried, I added a whole mess of Viejo Model Colour White to some Citadel Fulgrim Pink, because the Fulgrim Pink wasn't pink enough, because the next step is chipping. Now, there are a million different ways to do chipping. I sometimes brush it on, I sometimes do other methods. For this method, I'm doing the sponge application method. I've just got a little bit of spare packing sponge. I've got all the white was dumped into the pot of Fulgrim Pink, so it's pre-mixed in the pot. And all I'm doing is I'm getting a blob of paint on that. It's a bit like dry brushing really. I've got a blob of paint on it. I'm getting a lot of paint off on this piece of card. I'm just testing it out, gently tapping it on, and as I get happy with how it looks, I then start applying it to the big model. Now, the idea is I want to apply random chips here and there and build them up in certain areas and not in other areas. You kind of have to do it logically. You kind of have to go instinctively where you think more chipping would be on edges and contact surfaces and things like that. You just want to build it up slowly. Keep moving the sponge around. If you want to, you can reorient the sponge in your fingers every now and then to change the footprint of it, just to make it varied. And it's just a case of dropping it occasionally, and then you have to do that. But yes, it's this basic process of going around the model and applying chipping. Now, it is important, and I can't stress this enough, you can do too much when it comes to any kind of weathering. The golden rule is go slowly, do a little bit. If you think it needs a bit more, do a bit more. If you think it still needs a bit more, do a bit more. If at any point though, you sit there and think, is that enough? I don't know, maybe I need some. As soon as you have those doubts, stop. Walk away, leave it for an hour or 2 hours, or come back the next day and look at it again with fresh eyes. If you could look at it straight away and say it needs more, then do more. If you're not sure, then it's probably enough. But walk away for a while and come back and look at it again. Because as with the best of things, less is in fact more. Next, it's time to get out the Skaven Blight Dinge, because we're going to work on those chips even more. We're going to do a 2-stage chipping on this, maybe a 3-stage later on, but at this point just a 2-stage chipping process. Now, like I said before, there's a million different ways you can do chipping, and there's a million different levels of detail you can apply to those chips. You can have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-stage chipping. What we want to simulate here is a real simple way of simulating paint that's chipped away and is showing something underneath. Now, in reality, this could be bare metal, it could be an imagined primer colour, it could be a different colour if the vehicle's been repainted. Say it's a blue tank and it was painted pink, the paint might chip away and show blue. It's whatever headcanon you've invented. But one handy tip for you, if you're not really sure, there's 2 go-to colours for not just Warhammer, but any kind of real world or any kind of armoured fighting vehicle and tanks and stuff like that. The first sort of typical generic colour you might want to use is a warm dark grey, anything like this is Skaven Blight Dinge, or you might use German grey or something like that, something very similar. It does nothing specific, it just suggests that underneath the paint, where the paint's chipped away, you've got maybe some kind of primer or just bare metal. And keep in mind that bare metal isn't always silver and shiny. Some bare metals can be dull and dark grey, so it just suggests some kind of big heavy industrial metal underneath there. The paint's chipped away and exposed that. Another option you might have is to use a rusty red-brown type tone in your chips, and this just suggests that where the paint's come away, it's not exposed shiny clean metal or dull grey metal, it's exposed corroded metal, so it's got a red-brown tinge. That just suggests that kind of wear and tear under the paint, or you can mix and match. Now those are just two of the generic ideas. You could do whatever colour you want and explain it in your head canon. What is important though is where you apply these chips. The idea is that you want to suggest that some chips are deeper and heavier than others. So where there's light chips or light scuffs and wear and tear, you've just got the lighter version of your body colour, in this case the fulgrim pink with some white added. That's just where paint's scuffed away and exposed cleaner paint underneath. The dark bits are where the paint's been removed completely, you've got the substrate underneath. Because you want to simulate that, it's important that when you do these grey chips or red-brown chips, whatever colour, you put them inside the lighter coloured chips, because you want a halo of the lighter colour around the darker colour. This just suggests that you've got the main body colour, then the paint's chipped away a little bit and exposed a clean area, and then in the middle of that, the chunk of it has come out and you've got the bare metal. Now you don't have to paint a dark chip inside every single light chip, it's entirely up to you. Some variation makes it look more convincing. Be sparing because these are more obvious to see. But I do recommend you paint them inside light chips and not just free floating around on the bodywork, because it gives the chip a kind of three-dimensionality. It's not just a dark splotch on a light coloured vehicle, it's a dark splotch with some sort of depth to it. It just makes it more convincing. It's not realistic, but our aim here is not necessarily realism, just it makes it pop, it makes it come alive, it makes it a bit more convincing than just painting dots. Otherwise you've just made a spotty tank. Now you could do this with the sponge as well, but this gives you more control of placing the dark chips inside the light chips. Otherwise it's a bit higgledy-piggledy and it's all over the shop. And of course when you're doing the light chips, you could brush paint them on instead of using a sponge. It just takes a lot longer, but it is more precise and you have a bit more control. Once that's all done and dusted, the next step is to start blocking in some colours. Now there's a few steps here that I could probably leave till later, but I wanted to get everything sort of blocked in just to give me an idea of what's going where. And I'm starting off with some of the silver details. There's not many of these. There's this grille, there's some handrails, some of the barrels on the weapons. Not too many details at all, but I'm starting off with Citadel's lead belcher just to get a basic silver coat down. Now you will see me later on kind of paint over these with some of the weathering and other steps and then have to go back and do them again. That's fine. I'm just really getting the lay of the land with these. I sometimes like to mark everything out with the right basic colours and then come back and tidy them up later. There's no real hard and fast rules here. You can see here on these barrels the paint's looking a bit patchy and uneven, but that's fine, that's not a problem. What I tend to do is do this first coat, get it down. I don't go back over the same areas, I don't keep working the paint. As soon as I get paint on a spot, I move on from that spot and leave it. Once it's dry, I'll come back in with one or two more coats, but thinner than normal, a bit thinner than this, and somehow it just manages to give me a nice smooth metallic finish. With that done, we move to Citadel's Rhinox Hide paint. This is a wonderful warm brown colour, and with this I'm going to paint the rusty exhaust, taking my inspiration from real life World War II Matilda tanks. Now I'm painting this on, I've obviously got it on my wet palette with a little bit of extra water added as usual, but I'm not being too careful here. I'm not worried if it looks a little bit patchy, if it's not like a solid colour coat. We're going to make a rusty effect and we're going to use a few various colours, and I want uneven patchiness, because if you go out and look at something that's rusty, it's not just brown, it's patchy brown with darker brown bits and light brown bits and some orange bits and some red bits and all different colours depending on the metal. So I'm basically just getting this paint down, and I'm not doing a second coat, I'm just getting this one coat down. It's one coat at a time for this, and now Duncan would be swearing at me if he could. Next it's time to go in with the XV88 for a little spot of dry brushing to continue the rusty effects. Now if you've not done dry brushing before, you need a soft flat brush. Many manufacturers make specific dry brushes. This is the Army Painter and Citadel do loads of them. But you want a flat brush for the right effect. You get some paint on the brush, you take most of it off on a piece of tissue, With almost no paint left on the brush now, we need to wipe it onto the surface we're trying to dry brush. Now there's various ways of doing dry brushing. This backwards and forwards flicking is just highlighting raised surfaces and raised edges. That's like highlight or edge dry brushing. You can also work the brush into some of the flatter areas with little circular motions to try and build up a texture and a sort of shade and blend. That's what I'm doing on here because I want to get this rusty effect. I don't just want to pick up the edges, I want to get the rusty colours everywhere. So I'm working it into some of the recesses, but I'm also taking advantage of it, hitting the edges and doing a highlight dry brush. And I'm just going to go around and get this on. Now I am also painting over those silver bits that I painted before. Yeah, I don't mind that. I'll go back and do them later. Sometimes, like I said, I like to paint too far forward and then have to take a few steps back just so I know what's going where. It helps inspire me sometimes. Next up we have Citadel's Tau Light Ochre for the third of our rust colours. This is a more yellowy, brighter, bolder brown colour, more mustardy coloured. And this is going to be, again, another dry brush, but a bit more focused this time. We're going to focus more on the raised edges and highlights and less on the centres of panels. So we're not going to really do as much coverage as we did with the last colour. We're going to keep it a bit more targeted, mostly on the edges, and this is just to give a nice sort of bright highlight area. We're going to build it up where we think water would collect, because it's all about making this look patchy and random, but also slightly logical. Next up, our final colour is Vallejo Game Colour Orange Fire. This is going to be the real sort of bright orangey accent colour. Now notice I put the paint on a bit of card there. When you're doing dry brushing, you do not want to use your wet palette. That's the whole point of a dry brush, is the paint needs to be thick, not diluted down, because you're getting most of it off on your brush and you don't want it to flow anywhere. So whenever you're doing dry brushing, with Citadel colours you can go straight from the pot. With other dropper bottle paints, you want to get a little bit of it on a piece of card or tile or glass or something non-porous. Just don't put it on your wet palette. Now here we're being much more focused than last time. We're just going for really raised edges. Keep in mind with rust that the brighter the colour, the fresher the rust. So dark brown is the old rust, that's all corroded away. The orangey stuff you see on rusty metal is kind of the more recent stuff, and therefore here I'm focusing on edges and areas where water would collect and the corrosion will be ongoing the most. So there'll be constant corrosion, like where water would pool. Next up, I've dug out the Beastie Brown from Vallejo Game Colour, and I'm going to be working on the tracks. I'm going to get these painted up. Now, I didn't need to do this at this point. I could have left this as the last thing I did on the whole tank, was to do the tracks. But again, like I said before, I like to block colours out and get a feel for what's going to go where, so I can adjust as I go. And if I'm painting something and I realise it might not work with something else I've already blocked in, I can then see that. I don't want to get to the end and be doing the last thing and realise it's not going to work. So I sometimes like to get ahead of myself, and I could end up repainting these later on. We'll see how it goes. Now this is quite a bright colour. It's not maybe the ideal colour for a track. I'm going to go for a dirty, rusty track look, but I wanted it to be different enough from the exhaust. I don't want the exhausts and the tracks at the end to look the same colour, because that would just be a bit boring. I want some difference. But when you're doing rusty metals, they're all going to kind of look a much of a muchness. So I'll see if I can pull this back a bit later on. Looking at it now, it's maybe a bit bright, but we'll figure it out. Don't panic. Next, it was time for me to focus on the interior, what little there is. It's all on the turret. Now, if you've seen any of my other armoured vehicle or aircraft type builds, you'll know that I tend to favour zinc chromate effects. Now, if you don't know what that is, on a lot of vintage aircraft and armoured fighting vehicles, you'd often have green interiors, and the reason for that is, instead of spending all the time and money painting and priming and preparing the interiors, especially of aircraft, what they used to do was simply coat them in zinc chromate, which is a green colour. It protected the metal from corrosion, but it wasn't as expensive as priming and painting it. That's why That's why vintage aircraft and stuff often have this green interior, and I quite like that, so I often try and replicate that. However, for this, I'm actually going to go for a more traditional vintage tank interior, especially World War II, where the interiors were often painted a sort of off-white colour. It looks really nice. Now, there's not a lot of it here to paint, but that's what I'm going for. Now, the reason I'm starting with Celestra Grey and not white is because the golden rule of painting white is, first of all, don't ever paint just white. Two reasons. One, white's really transparent and you'll see whatever's underneath, and it'll be a pain in the bum. It'll take you a billion coats to cover up whatever's underneath. Second of all, if you just paint something white, how do you do a highlight? You can't, because it's already white. So the trick is to start off white and then add white as a highlight colour later on. Now, if I'm going to be painting light colours and off-whites here, I can't go in with those straight away because they'll just have the pink showing through. Celestra Grey is a very opaque base colour. A couple of coats of this and that pink is completely gone. Then when I paint a white or an off-white over it, it'll look nice and bright and there'll be no hint of that pink showing through. So if you are painting white and you have the Citadel paints, always go for Celestra Grey as your base colour. It's fantastic. Now it's time for one of my favourite Citadel paints, Retributor Armour, a beautiful, beautiful gold colour. And I've only got a couple of little bits to touch in here, basically a couple of aquila and a skull on the tank, and that's about it. Now again, this is one of those steps that I could just leave till after we've done all the weathering, but I thought I might as well block them in. I don't mind if I have to go back over it. I do enjoy painting with this colour anyway. And I might find that once I've done the weathering, the gold looks exactly as I want it. So it's always worth doing all these little blocking in touches just at the start. You can always go back and do them again later. Now I've no idea why I painted these bits out of sequence with the gold before this bit, but next I went back to the interior and worked with some Ulthuan Grey. Now if you remember, I said the Celestra Grey was to block out the pink part so the pink doesn't show through, make a good base for the white or the off-whites that we're going to paint on the top, and that is the Ulthuan Grey. If I just painted Ulthuan Grey over the pink, it'd take me 5 coats and it'd have a pink tinge to it because it's kind of transparent. The Celestra Grey is neutral, it's not got any real tint either way, and it just blocks out that pink, so it's a great colour to start with. And I'm basically painting over the whole area with the Ulthuan Grey. I did the interior of the cupola as well, you can see there where the dude is, just covering all of that Celestra Grey. The Celestra Grey is purely functional, you're not going to see any of it. And this isn't the end of the interior, this is just blocking in, so I will return to the interior at a later time. Now before we crack on with the weathering, the next step of course is to get the decals done, because remember, decals represent markings painted on the vehicle and they'll get weathered with everything else, so we need to get the water slide decals on. And I have acquired some Hello Kitty nail water slide decals. These are decals for fingernails. Now, like many sort of non-mass produced water slide decals, these are not pre-cut. If I tilt these in the light, and it might not come out on camera, there's no bit of carrier film around each piece of artwork. It's just one single piece of carrier film with all the artwork on, so we need to trim every single decal. Now there's nothing really too complicated to explain about this, you just need to very carefully cut away the film and the paper around the image, leaving a minimal, absolute minimal amount of paper around the image. Basically you are making the carrier film limit, you're cutting where that carrier film will finish. So the closer you can get the better. Don't go right up to the artwork because you might cut into the artwork and that'll just look terrible. So leave a tiny little gap but keep it as small as you can. I do recommend putting a fresh blade into your cutting knife, and I do recommend putting some sort of tape or sponge around your knife. You can see I've got blue tape around mine because this really hurts your fingers after about 5 minutes. You need to do this to every single water slide if it's not a pre-cut or pre-carrier film cut sheet of decals. Now a lot of people are scared of water slide decals, so I'm going to show you the next bit in real time. Once you've trimmed the decal, dunk it in some warm water, not hot water but warm water, for sort of 5 or 10 seconds, and then put it on the bench in a little bubble of its own water. It'll probably bring some water with it, or if you need to dampen it with a brush you can. As it sits there, you want to gently prod it with a brush every now and then, just to wait for the moment when the decal actually slides around freely on the carrier paper. Some decals take up to a minute, some decals like this one, it does it straight away. Also depends on how warm the water is. If it's cold water, it'll take longer. As soon as it moves freely on the backing paper, you just need to apply it to the model. Now I am showing you this real time, so if I'm not doing anything, I'm probably just fumbling for a pair of tweezers or something like that. Or a cocktail stick in this case, which I didn't have to hand because I wasn't prepared, because I am spec. My tank bill, please like and subscribe. There you go. So you don't need many tools, you need a brush, some tweezers and a cocktail stick. So I'm going to grab the backing paper, not the decal, just making sure it's moving. Grab it by the backing paper and not the decal. Fox, anytime. There you go, thank you. Grab it by the paper. Prepare the model to receive the water slide, and then just gently slide it off. You can use your brush or a finger if it's big enough. Just gently pull the paper out from under the decal. Don't pull the decal, pull the paper out from underneath. Once it's on, you can see if it moves around freely. Don't actually try and drag tweezers or a stick or a brush on the decal. Try and push it from the edges of it, so you're kind of pushing it rather than dragging it. Now you see here it's not really moving very freely, so I'm going to moisten it. If it doesn't move, just put a bit more water underneath and it'll start to slide around. You can see me there using the cocktail stick just to push it. I'm not digging into the decal itself, I'm just pushing it from the edges. Be very gentle. You can use a stick or tweezers if you can. Once you've got it where you want it, you need to squeeze it down and get any excess water out from underneath. So get yourself a cotton bud or Q-tip for our colonial cousins and just roll that cotton bud gently over the decal. Don't just push it down. You can't really see, but I'm rolling it, and that will squeeze out any excess water that's underneath the decal, hopefully without moving it. If you do find when you've done this that you've moved it and it's in the wrong place, you just need to wet it again, get it wiggling around and reposition it and repeat the process. And that is now applied. That's how long it takes. There's nothing dark art about that. There's nothing complicated. Simply get it off the backing paper, put it in place, squeeze all the water out from underneath. Done. Now there is one more step, of course, which is getting decal setting solutions to help it bed down properly, but I'll show you that in a moment. One other thing you may hear about with decals is that some people may do gloss varnishing before they put decals down, and I do sometimes. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It's not the end of the world if you don't. A lot of people will put a gloss coat down first to give a smooth surface and to make sure there's as little air as possible trapped under the decal, because it can cause silvering where the decal looks all silvery because there's air stuck underneath. However, it's not absolutely necessary. If it's a very rough surface, or if it's an uneven surface, so it's got texture to it, or rivets, or it's all ribbed or something like that, then a gloss surface may help with that, help the decal to bed down to it. But where these are just going on a simple flat surface, this is going straight onto the paint. Now some people might get a bit shouty and say you have to do a gloss coat, and I'll be honest, I used to do a gloss coat all the time until I at one point had no choice and had to put decals onto bare paint and found out it was absolutely fine. But some people will be shouty, but you know what? Ignore them. It's your choice. Yes, the chances of getting any kind of air trapped under the decal are microscopically higher if you don't use a gloss coat, but I wouldn't lose sleep over it. Like I said, unless it's a really rough textured surface, you're fine putting them over paint. Once the decals are on, I applied some decal setting solutions here, Micro Set and Micro Sol. Now again, this is a completely optional step. These solutions will help your decals bed down to the surface better and they'll look more like painted on details. But don't worry if you can't get these solutions or the Mr. Hobby equivalents, which is Mr. Mark Setter and Mr. Mark Softer. Don't worry too much. It's not the end of the world. They will make things look a little bit better, but you'll still look fine without them. But if you can get them, I do recommend it. Basically, how do you use these? Dead simple. After about 10 or 15 minutes, when your decal looks nice and dry and it's been on there, you go in first of all with a nice coat of Micro Set, and all you're doing is you're brushing it over the decal. Now don't drown it and don't get it everywhere. Best practice is to just get the solution over the decal, around the edge, and just a little bit over the edge of the decal. You want to get it just over the edge so it seeps underneath. This solution Micro Set will help it bed down and suck down to the surface. You don't want to splash it everywhere because in excessive amounts it can damage gloss coats and it can eat into paint layers. So go steady. Get a goodly helping, but make sure it's focused on the decal and the very edges, just enough so it can suck underneath. Give it 10 or 50, maybe even 20 minutes to cure, and that will help that decal suck down to the surface. Now the decal may go all wrinkly when you put this on. Do not touch it. Even if it looks terrible, leave it. It's doing its work. It makes the decal expand and contract, and that's how it helps it suck down. So get it on, leave it for 10 or 15 minutes, and wait till it looks dry. Once it's been dry for 10 or 15 minutes, you put the micro set away and you move on to the micro sole, and you do exactly the same. Get it over the decal and just around the edges, apply a coat, watch it go wrinkly, and then let it dry, and then you can apply multiple coats of the micro sole if you need to. If after a couple of coats of micro sole the decal looks nice and smooth and flat, that's it, that's all you need to do. If it's going over a rough surface or a grill or texture and it's not quite bedding down properly, just keep doing more and more coats with 10 or 15 minutes between each one. Eventually it'll bed down nicely. The microsol will also eat away a bit of the clear film and help it look more painted on. So one coat of microset and then as many coats as you need of microsol with about 10 or 15 minutes between each until everything looks fantabulous. And that's it. That is how hard decals are. Go get it done. It's not scary at all. Next up, it's time to have some fun! Oil paints fun. Yes, you can see here I have some oil paints on this handy dandy random bit of plastic. Yes, thank you, pointy finger. We have some oil paints ready because we're going to do a dot filter. Now I'm going to list the colours on the screen here, the paints I've used, but it doesn't actually matter with a dot filter what colours you use. As long as you've got some variation, you've got some dark and some light. I often find a green and light blue quite nice, and the rusty colours and the browns help to give a rusty effect. But this is basically a way to do some very, very quick staining and streaking and weathering on a surface that looks completely random but also completely natural. Now you don't need to go for exactly these brands of paints or these specific colours, but this is one area where you do want to spend a little bit of money. You absolutely must use oil paints for this effect. You can't use acrylics or enamels or anything like that. It's not going to work. It has to be oil paints, and you want to maybe go for quality because cheap oil paints have really crappy pigments and like lots of bittiness and particles, and you'll see a texture. If you're using model making oil paints, I strongly recommend the 502 Abteilung oil paints. They are beautiful and designed for model making. They blend and smooth perfectly. The pigments are really, really fine, finer than many artist oils. For artist oils, personally I would recommend Daler Rowney or Winton. They're two of the best manufacturers of artist oil paints, but again, they're not cheap, but it's worth the money. Let's crack on. Now this process is one of the simplest weathering processes there is that you can do. Any chud can do this. So why is it called the dot filter? Well, it's called a filter because at the end result you'll have added a tiny little sort of tint to the surface of the model, and that's called filtering. You're adding a filter over the pink. So it's an old theatre term. If I take a white stage light and I put a piece of transparent red plastic over the light, I've added a red filter and the light is now red. It's that principle. You'll be adding a transparent colour over the top of, in this case, the pink, and it will change the tone ever so slightly. It'll tint it ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly. And why is it called the dot filter? You can see I'm doing dots. This is why any chud can do this. The first step is literally taking little tiny dots of your oil paint and blapping them all over the model, wherever you want, randomly as possible, as much or as little as you like. It's entirely open-ended. There's no right and wrong with this. There is, however, only one point that you need to consider before you get to this point. Some people will have done the decals and then covered the model in a gloss varnish to seal the decals in, and perhaps they want to do a pin wash. If the last thing you did before this dot filter was a gloss varnish, be aware that having a gloss or a matte surface will affect the end result of your dot filter. Things like dot filters and streaking work better over a matte or a satin finish. So either you've matte varnished it, you do it over bare paint, or you do it over a satin varnish. You can do it over gloss, but the next step in the process, which is just wiping all this paint off again. If it's a gloss surface, most of that paint will just come off and it'll look just like little patches of streaks and paint. If you've got a matte or a satin surface, much of the paint will be retained by the model surface and it'll give more of a tint and a dirty, grubby look. So if you're looking to get a nice streaky, dirty, grimy look, ideally for this process you want a matte or at worst a satin surface. A gloss surface, there's no harm in doing it, but it's not going to give you the same result. A gloss surface is great for getting just paint in the recesses. A matte or satin finish means that the surface will retain more of that pigment and it'll give it a more dirty look. So that is something that's entirely up to you. When you finish your decals, whether you want to seal them in with a gloss matte or satin varnish, it's up to you. Just keep in mind the result that will have, the effect that will have on the dot filter process. For me personally, when I finish the decals, I'll seal them in with a matte varnish because this process does work best on a matte finish. And here we have the end result of all that insane dottiness, and that looks insane! Looks like I had a special moment and went a bit doolally, but this is what you want. Again, it doesn't really matter what colours you use, as long as there's a nice range of them. Because the next step is the real fun bit. The next step is where we get to munge all this up. Now, the reason you have to use oil paints, like I said earlier on, is because oil paints take a long time to dry. So the first thing you want to do, the first step, before you do anything, is get yourself a big, flat, soft brush. Now I am preparing some oil paint thinners here, but you may not need them. The first thing you want to do is try messing up these paints just with a dry brush. And that's what I'm doing here. Nice, soft, flat, big artist brush. And all I'm doing is I'm trying to streak those paints. Now keep in mind, in real world, which way does water streak and down the side of a vehicle when it rains? When the water pours down the side, which way does the water go? Go with the flow of gravity, because some of this is going to blend away and some of it's going to remain as little subtle streaks, and it makes sense if the streaks go the same way that water does when it gets rained on and it drips and it drags contaminants like rust and dirt down the side of the vehicles. So if it's a vehicle, like a wheel vehicle, always go from top to bottom. If it's an aircraft, you might want to go from front to back, but keep that in mind, that the streaks on the surface of a vehicle are dirt and dust and corrosion being pulled along by water. So which way those streaks are going to go? Now you can see here, this paint's being a bit resistant. It's not quite blending and fading, but that's fine. It's been on there for about 20 minutes and it's quite a thin layer, so it's kind of curing quite fast. So don't worry, if you're doing this and it's not really moving much, you can carry on and keep going and keep going, and eventually it will all blend away. Or, like I do in a second, you can just dampen the brush with a touch of thinner, just the tiniest amount, and that will help it move around each more, which I'll do in a second. I'll just cut the video now to that point. So here we go. I'm getting bored of that not moving now, so I'm getting a little tiny amount of thinner, oil paint thinners. Get most of that thinner off on the tissue, and then we carry on. This will just help move the paint around and dissolve it into the solution a bit more, and it'll help build up some streaks. If you think you've got too much thinner and it's too wet, just take a bit more off. And I'm being very, very gentle. I'm hardly touching the model at all with the brush. I'm just, if you pardon the pun, brushing it past. I'm very keen to keep the direction of flow from top to bottom, or if it's a flat surface like this, from front to back, something like that, being consistent. The pigment will dissolve in the thinners and then move around the surface. It will collect in recesses and around rivets and on edges, and because you're going from top to bottom, it will collect in under overhangs and in small recesses at the bottom. It will naturally have that sense of flow and direction, and it will also, all the colours will blend into one, and you'll get a uniform, very, very transparent, streaky, dirty coat. So if you remember, we had like black and brown and red brown, and there was a light blue and a bright green. They've all gone. It's all blended away, and you'll see at the end they'll blend it away into a nice generic homogeneous sort of dirt layer, and that's the trick. You're not looking to necessarily get lots of streaks, but they will be there by default, very faint ones. You're just looking to make it look used, and you're also filling some of the panel lines and recess details at the same time. It's a very subtle way of doing it. There's a million different ways to do weathering and streaking and recess shading. This is just one of them. It's dead simple, it's great fun, you can't mess it up. I do recommend it. And at the end of all that, this is what we have. Now, we're nowhere near finished at all. There's still loads more to do, but I'm going to call this episode here because it's already 40 minutes long. We've got lots more to do, so we'll do that in the next episode. But you can see the kind of effect that dot filter has had on the paintwork. It's just grubbied it up nicely. It's put some shading into the recesses. You can see at the back there under that grill and near the exhaust there's like a brown streak. That's purely accidental, and the streaks on the back of the turret are completely accidental. That's the beauty of this process. For the majority of it, it just tints the whole surface and dirties it up, but occasionally you'll get a happy accident streak. But that's going to do us, so thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Make sure to check out all the links in the description below the video for all the ways you can support this channel. Until then, I shall say take care of yourselves, go make something awesome, go be awesome, and until next time, adios amoebas, my friends.